Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So today we're going to continue to work with narrative, but our real focus is on description. Descriptive language is a very important part of any successful narrative. So that's what we're going to look at today. We started talking a little bit about description last time when I mentioned imagery. And I talked about imagery as any language that we might find in a narrative or even a different type of writing, any language that we find that really makes us utilize our five senses, our sensory impressions. That means our sense of sight, our sense of smell, our sense of hearing, our sense of taste, and even our sense of touch. So anytime we find words, sentences, phrases, any passage from a text that we're reading that makes us use those senses, that makes us imagine that we can see something or smell something or hear something. Any language like that does qualify as imagery, even though typically we just think about imagery in terms of our sense of sight, because that is the sense that most people utilize the most. But imagery can refer to any of those sensory impressions, and that's kind of a good place to start today with description, because description often will draw on all of those different kinds of imagery, but also good description relies on strong verbs, strong adjectives, maybe even adverbs. So we need to think a little bit about a couple of these specific types of speech today and how they can add more vivid detail to what we read, because that's really the name of the game with description. We want concrete details. We want really vivid, specific details. Things that readers are going to really notice, things that are going to stand out. Again, things that make us feel like we can see them, hear them, smell them, or just at least imagine them. That's what good descriptive writing does. It really brings narratives and other types of writing to life because it makes us feel like we are there. We are experiencing what is being described. We are seeing it, hearing it, smelling it, taking part in it ourselves. That's a big part of what makes something enjoyable to read. Those descriptive details, that good use of descriptive language. So I want to go through a few key concepts related to description today. And in our readings for this week, we're going to be looking at some examples of good descriptive writing. So we're going to be able to find a lot of evidence. A lot of the stuff that we talk about today, we're going to be able to find it in what we are reading this week. So I want to start with the idea of sort of how, just a general idea of how description can work. Some descriptions will be what we call objective, meaning they're kind of neutral. The goal is simply to arrive at a precise, accurate description. So objective descriptions are just striving for accuracy. Those are descriptions that are attempting to recreate a scene, to paint a picture in our minds, and to do it accurately with a close attention to detail. So a lot of different authors will use objective descriptions. We're certainly going to find some of those in narratives. We're going to find some of those in other types of writing in our book. But also, we could expect to find objective descriptions in places like science writing, or ideally news reports, news stories, journalism. That type of writing will often strive for objective descriptions. Not really passing judgment, not really sharing personal opinions or viewpoints, but rather just trying to describe things accurately, as they really happened, as they really appeared, and really just paying attention to those concrete details. So That's subjective description. We also have what's called subjective description. And that draws a lot more heavily on emotion and personal feelings. So if we are being subjective, that means we're not trying to be neutral. We're not trying to just capture the facts. We're also bringing our own personal feelings, emotions, and viewpoints to the table. So subjective is not going to be neutral. It's going to be slanted in a particular way based on how we feel, what we think, and most importantly, how we feel and what we think about the things that we are describing. We can describe almost anything, right? We can describe people, we can describe places, we can describe events, we can also describe abstract things, things that might not be like material objects in the world, but they are concepts or ideas that people frequently talk about and think about, like love, loyalty, right? These are concepts, these are ideas. They exist in the world, but we can describe them in lots of different ways. So, depending on how we feel about the thing that we are describing, we're going to describe it potentially in a lot of different ways. If we have positive opinions, positive feelings about the person, place, or thing that we are describing, those positive feelings might drive our description. We might focus primarily on the most favorable aspects. If we're describing our favorite beach or a place that we really like, we're going to probably focus on what makes that place beautiful, pleasant, enjoyable. We're going to focus on the good, the positive qualities. Whereas if we are describing something that is scary, something that is bad, something that is dangerous, we're going to describe it in a different way. If we are describing a haunted house, we're going to focus maybe on some of the negative qualities of this place. What makes it spooky? What makes it mysterious? What makes it potentially deadly? So that's going to be a very different type of description. We're going to be focusing on different things, talking about different things, and sort of presenting things in a way that sort of lines up with our own feelings or emotions. So depending on whether we're being objective or subjective, we're going to sort of arrive at a different, what we call dominant impression. So the dominant impression is sort of like the narrative. It's like the equivalent of what we were talking about with the narrative point, or that overall point or theme of a narrative. The big idea, the bigger message that a narrative is trying to communicate. That's similar to what we're dealing with here with dominant impression. The dominant impression is sort of like the theme or the big idea behind the subject that you are describing. It is the overall impression of that subject that you want to convey or communicate. So again, if you're describing a beautiful beach, that dominant impression that you want to get across to your audience is probably going to be based on tranquility, peacefulness, relaxing. You're going to emphasize the sound the water makes, the color of the water, how the sand feels on your bare feet, the way the sun feels. You might describe, the weather, the pleasant atmosphere, right? So the dominant impression is going to make readers feel pretty good. It's going to make readers feel relaxed because we can imagine that we are there on that beach with you. But if you're describing that haunted house, it's scary, it's mysterious, bad things are going to happen there. You're creating a very different sort of dominant impression. You want the dominant impression of that description of the house to be scary, to be foreboding, to be ominous, to be mysterious, or to convey the danger that the house contains. So you're going to have different goals with different descriptions. And based on whether you're being subjective and whether you have good feelings, whether you have bad feelings, those positions, those feelings, those emotions will result in different overall dominant impressions that are created by your description. And if you're trying to create an objective description, you might want the dominant impression to really just be based on, again, whatever it is you're describing. If you're describing a tragedy, the impression might be sadness, sorrow, regret. If you're describing something that was a positive event, or if you're simply trying to present facts, then that dominant impression might be more geared towards just accuracy and recreating what happened. But anytime we get subjective with our descriptions, we're going to end up with something that leans more positive or something that leans more negative. And again, that might be true even with objective descriptions. If we're describing something objectively bad, then we're going to create that sort of a dominant impression that sort of emphasizes or really strongly communicates the bad. Whereas if we're describing something that is objectively good or joyous, then our dominant impression is going to be joyous. It's going to communicate that feeling. So just be aware of that as you're reading so you can have better control over those things when you are writing. And anytime we're talking about description, we're really focusing on specific details, descriptive details. So you always want to ask yourself, once you've decided, okay, I'm going to describe this thing, this building, this person, this plant, this beach, whatever the subject is, you always need to decide, okay, what details about this subject do I want to include? If you are describing a person, what physical qualities are you going to include? Are you going to mention the person's height? Are you going to mention their hair color, their eye color? Are you going to mention some other things, other descriptive details that might not be strictly physical, like how they talk? Are you going to describe their personality? Because that could also be a part of the description. Are you going to focus on the physical? Are you going to talk about other things like their voice or their mood or their overall personality? There's not really a right or wrong answer. Some descriptions can just be physical, and that's fine. Other descriptions are a lot more focused on things like personality, sense of humor, things that aren't necessarily physical traits, but you have to make those decisions as the writer. And you'll notice that the authors that we are reading, they're making those decisions. And the stuff that we read, they're deciding which details to provide. So if you're describing a scene, the way something looks, if you're describing a particular event, things that are happening, again, you have to figure out, what do I want to include? What's important? You can't really include everything. Some things have to be left up to the reader to sort of, figure out or fill in themselves. But you have to decide, what are the most important details? Do I want to focus on the physical? Do I want to focus on other things? There's lots of just sort of easy ways to get started. Often this is really all about observation. So if you have the chance to actually observe the thing that you are describing, you really just want to start writing things down. Okay? The sky looks like blank. There are trees over there. The water is, blank. You can describe the color. You can describe if it's moving or if it's tranquil. This goes with anything. Anything that you're actually observing, you just want to write down things that you notice, details that you observe. However, if you are describing something that's not right in front of you at the moment, something that you remember, an event that you previously participated in, a place that you have been, but you're not currently looking at it, then obviously you're relying on your memory. you might not be quite as accurate, but that's okay. You can do the best you can, but do the same basic exercise. Write down details, write down individual things that you remember, colors, shapes. You can also think about distances between things if you're describing like physical objects, or if you're describing the scene at a beach or a river or a beautiful, mountaintop. Distances, relationships between different objects are sometimes important to include. Those might be important details to help your readers see what you are describing. So you kind of have to make these decisions for yourself. What kinds of details do you want to include for anything that you are describing? And then once you've written down some individual observations or details, the next step is to start organizing them. Okay, how are you going to present all these details? If you have a lot, you really have to organize them and figure out, okay, what's coming first? What do I get to next? Am I going to organize them by type? Physical qualities here, other qualities there. Am I going to start with spatial relationships and then move into colors and then move into sounds? How are you going to do it? You just need to sort of figure out an organizational structure that you can use to put all of those details together in a logical, sort of easy to follow way. So there's a couple of different strategies that you can use. Sometimes we organize details by space, by those spatial relationships. So think about walking through a city or town. The way you might describe that place could really be based on spatial relationships and your own movement. So if you are walking through the town, if you are the narrator telling the story, then the way you organize the details really just might be based on space and how you are moving through space. So you're just describing things as you see them, describing the town as you see it, describing what you see as you walk down a street. There's this building, next door is this other building, around the corner is a park. So that's kind of a spatial pattern that you can use to organize details. But there's other ways too, like a chronological pattern. If you're describing your first day at school or your first day at work, even if you're just working with a distant memory, you can use a chronological structure to organize all of those details. I woke up at 8 a.m. I got to work at 8:30, and you can just walk us through everything that happened on that day, following this sort of linear or chronological format. First this happened, and then next this happened, and then later I saw this, I experienced that. You can just walk us through in sort of chronological order. And there's also what's called the emphatic structure or pattern, where you sort of emphasize the most important stuff first, or maybe you get to the most important stuff last, but you're arranging your details based on importance and emphasis. What do you want to emphasize the most? And that might help you determine how you're going to organize the details. You could also use a sensory pattern. If you really want to walk through multiple senses, you could start with sight, move on to sound, and kind of progress accordingly. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. There's a lot of different ways to come up with different details and observations, and then to organize them in a way that will help to really make your narrative work better. There's a lot of ways to do this. We can observe some of the different ways that the authors in our book do this. But no matter what your writing style is, no matter what kind of narrative you're writing, and no matter what things you are describing, there are certain types of speech that you do want to pay a little bit more attention to when you're doing description. you really do want to think a little bit more about verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. We don't have to be grammar masters. We don't have to know a ton about all of these types of speech, but we need to know how to use them. So we know what verbs are, right? Verbs describe actions. So verbs are obviously very important. When we're doing good description, we want strong verbs, strong, vivid verbs. I'm going to keep using the word vivid, so I want to define it. Vivid just means that we are producing strong feelings and clear images. And that's really what descriptive language should do. It should create feelings on the part of readers, and it should provide clear, concrete images or other types of imagery so people can really feel like they are there. Readers can really put themselves there. So strong verbs help. Strong verbs help to paint a clearer picture. So I just wanted to give you an example. Notice the difference between these two ways of describing the same thing. Okay, I could tell you on one hand that I walked slowly to class this morning. That's okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that description. I'm telling you how I walked. I'm giving you a little bit of detail about how my day started. But that's kind of boring and it's kind of bland, and I'm not really saying very much. Also notice that walked by itself is kind of a weak verb because there's lots of different ways that people can walk. There's lots of different kinds of walks. So walked by itself is not very strong. And there's evidence to prove that. It's not strong. We can see it's not strong because we have to modify it with the word slowly. We have to add another word to provide a little bit more detail and a more clear picture about the verb, because the verb alone doesn't really say very much, doesn't tell us very much. So we have to modify it with another word, which isn't always bad, but in this case, walked, it's just kind of bland. It's not doing very much. So we could replace it with a word like shuffled. And we're not changing the meaning. That's important to notice. Our meaning, the meaning behind our statement remains the same. I can tell you that I walked slowly to class this morning, or I could tell you that I shuffled to class this morning. If we look up the word shuffle, we'll find that it means to kind of drag your feet, to walk slowly, but often with your eyes sort of cast down. You're barely even picking your feet up off the ground. You're kind of sliding, moving reluctantly. And see, the reason this is a stronger verb is because it tells us more about the frame of mind of the character or the narrator. If I tell you that I shuffled to class this morning, that's giving you a lot more information, because if you look up the word, if you know the word, you know what it means, and you know what it means about me, the character. My eyes are downcast. I'm shuffling, I'm sort of just scuffling along. I'm not really even picking up my feet. So what does that mean? It probably means I'm reluctant to get to class. I don't want to get to class. I'm trying to delay getting to class. Why is that? There could be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe I did not study for the test I had that day. Maybe there's some other reason I don't want to be there. But that strong verb is at least providing a clue to my mental state. It's not just stating the basic action in a really boring, sort of bland way. Instead, it's giving readers access to how the character might feel. Because if you know I'm shuffling, then you know a little bit about how I look and how I might be feeling. Because typically, if we're walking very slowly, eyes downcast, not even picking up our feet, that means that we lack confidence. That means that we're feeling bad or we're apprehensive. in some way. And that might be important to know. That tells you, the reader, more about me, the character, because we're using a stronger verb. Okay, so this goes for a lot of things. You can say he ran fast. That's okay. That's adequate. But wouldn't it be better to say that he sprinted? It means the same thing, right? We're not changing the meaning, but notice two things that we are doing. We're replacing a kind of blah verb with a stronger, more vivid verb, more specific, but also we're actually being a little bit more efficient too. Because notice a lot of weak verbs, like we've already seen, they need help. They need modifiers. Those are often going to be adverbs that come after them that modify them because the verb by itself doesn't really tell us very much. But when we replace those weak verbs and their modifiers with stronger verbs, we notice that we're eliminating words. We're eliminating unnecessary words. Instead of ran fast, now it's just sprinted. Sprinted does all the work by itself that those two words combined had to do. So we're getting more efficient. We're also getting more specific, more detailed, and more vivid. And again, this will just make the reading experience more enjoyable and more informative for the readers. So another example, I was very happy as I walked home that day. I could say that. That's a fine statement. It's kind of descriptive, not really. I'm sort of just telegraphing the main impression of this particular picture that I'm painting. If my dominant impression is of a person who's happy, something good has just happened, and I want to communicate that, yeah, I can just tell the reader that the character is happy, but that's kind of boring. That's not very interesting. Instead, if I could use some better verbs, again, let's get rid of just I walked home, whatever, that's so bland. That could be a lot of things. I could walk home in a lot of different ways. Instead, let's sub out walked for, in place and replace it with some better verbs. So if I tell you that I glided home, or I floated home, I was so happy that I glided down the street, or I floated back home. Those kinds of verbs communicate my feelings. Those kind of verbs say more. They do more. Again, the meaning is not changing. I'm still communicating my happiness, but I'm doing it with specific, vivid verbs. If I floated, that means my feet don't even touch the ground. So I'm not speaking literally. I didn't literally do that, but that's how it felt because I was so happy, right? So verbs like that, they just do more. They express more meaning. They provide more detail, more info about characters or situations. So strong verbs will always help us to write better description. Another type of speech to pay attention to will be adjectives. We know that adjectives describe things. They're often describing nouns. So when we're choosing our adjectives, we need to choose good ones. Okay? Something is loud, okay, but if you really want to make that statement memorable, call it deafening. Okay? That's more powerful. That's more vivid. That's going to stick in the reader's mind a lot more than a sort of common, boring word like loud. Something isn't just painful, it's excruciating. Okay, so by having more intense, vivid, descriptive words, you're going to communicate much more clearly. You're going to give your readers a lot more to work with. And sometimes adverbs are okay. If we want to modify a verb, sometimes that's fine. So that's all an adverb is. It's a word that modifies a verb. Sometimes it modifies an adjective or some other type of speech. But frequently, it will be modifying a verb, the way we're going to use it in description. So if you're sweating, maybe don't just tell us that you're sweating, tell us that you're sweating profusely, especially if you're sweating because you're nervous. or you're hot. If you tell us that it's profuse sweating, you're sweating profusely, now we have a more vivid picture of what's going on. And now we know that you're not just a little bit nervous, you're really nervous. Now you're not just a little bit warm, you're burning up. So sweating, okay, kind of bland. It can, not always make a strong impression, but by modifying it with an adverb like profusely, a lot of adverbs end in ly. So a word like that makes the verb sort of jump off the page, and it paints a much more clear picture. Traffic was not just slow today, it was unbelievably slow. Or traffic moved at a crawl. Now we have something more vivid. We have a little bit more to sort of help us imagine what we are reading. So, you didn't just tap your pen, you impatiently tapped your pen. Now more insight is provided into the character's mental state, and again, we're just creating more vivid imagery for the reader. And maybe that impatient tapping, again, readers are going to be able to imagine what that sounds like, what that looks like, and they know what that signals about how the character feels and what's going on at that present moment with the character. So just pay attention, to your verbs, your adjectives, and maybe use a few good adverbs from time to time to modify some of your verbs that are a little bit bland on their own. So words like that go a long way. Good choices when it comes to words like that, that will go a long way towards writing good description. Another thing to keep in mind, when you are describing something, you have a point of view. So remember when we were talking about the key elements of narrative last week, we discussed point of view. And we said, every story is told to us using some type of narration, some type of narrative point of view. Maybe it's first person, maybe it's third person, but there's always a point of view. Well, the same goes for individual descriptions within a narrative. There's always going to be a specific point of view at work in that description. And it's going to be based on who's describing it and how they feel. So sometimes the point of view will be based on the physical relationship that you, the person writing the description, has with the subject of the description, the thing that you are describing. So if you're describing a mountain, your description is going to be at least partially based on where you are located in relation to that mountain. Are you describing it from the point of view of the mountaintop? Are you at the top looking down? That's going to be one type of description. Or are you at the base of the mountain looking up? That's going to be a very different description. Or are you somewhere around the middle of the mountain, like halfway towards your ascent? That's going to be a still different description. So depending on where you are, that's going to dictate a lot of the details that you include, those spatial relationships, and your overall attitude. If you're at the top of the mountain, you're probably feeling good. The dominant impression that you want to provide with this description might be sort of triumphant, optimistic, satisfied. You're appreciating the beautiful vista at the top. But if you're at the bottom and you're thinking about how difficult it's going to be to get to the top, the dominant impression, the mood that you're trying to sort of capture is going to be different. Maybe now it's fear, it's foreboding, you're worried, you're nervous, you're looking at how big this climb really is going to be. So that kind of point of view matters. Where are you? What is your perspective? Where are you located in relation to the thing that you are describing. And then also there's what we call the psychological point of view. How do you feel towards the thing that you're describing? So I've already mentioned this. If you have positive feelings, that's going to drive your description and create a very specific type of dominant impression. But if you have a negative attitude or a bad relationship with the thing that you are describing, then you're going to pick different details to focus on, and you're going to create a different sort of dominant impression. So just be aware of that stuff. And then finally, I want to wrap up with just a few other key concepts that we need to understand when it comes to description. I've already mentioned imagery, but I also want to get into figurative language and just a little bit about symbolism. So these are just sort of basic literary elements. They show up in a lot of literature like novels, short stories, poems, but they also show up in other types of writing, and they really are evident in almost any good descriptive writing. So these aren't just things that writers of novels and poetry use. These are things that a lot of writers use, particularly when they're trying to create vivid descriptions. So I've already mentioned imagery. We don't have to go back through that, but just remember all 5 senses are being activated when we're looking at imagery. But usually sight is the most common. Something that's kind of related to that is figurative language. This is another just sort of technique that writers use to make their writing more interesting, more full of meaning, but also it helps them to describe. It helps them to paint vivid pictures or to create vivid impressions for their readers. So the thing to remember about figurative language, there's lots of different kinds. We're going to talk about a few of the most common types in a moment, but just keep in mind the basic distinction between literal statements and figurative language. Figurative language goes beyond the literal. We don't mean figures of speech literally, but they are designed to express meaning. They are designed often to create comparisons, to make things clear or to make things sort of just, jump out or resonate with readers. So these are not literal statements. They're not meant to be taken as real or strictly factual, but they often still express truth, and they still help us to describe things. So let's start with a couple of types of figurative language that we should already be familiar with, or at least we've heard of them: metaphors and similes. A metaphor is simply comparing two unlike things in order to make a point or to make a vivid impression on readers. So basically we're saying one thing is the other thing. We don't mean that literally, but we're doing it to sort of make an idea land a little bit better or to make our description jump off the page a little bit better. So let's say we're describing somebody who is grieving. They've recently lost a loved one. We could use a metaphor to describe how this character is feeling. We could say that he is drowning in a sea of grief. That's not a literal statement. He's not literally drowning. There's no such thing as a literal sea of grief. That's not a real thing. Okay, but what we're doing with this metaphor is we're making a comparison. We're comparing the experience of grieving the loss of a loved one. We're comparing that to drowning. We're comparing that to the feeling of going underwater, being sort of helpless, and not being able to breathe. So again, it's not literal, but it's an imaginative, creative comparison that we are giving to our readers so our readers can have a better understanding of what this character is going through and how this character feels. So again, we could just say, he's really sad. And that would be the same meaning, but that's boring. Nobody's going to remember that. Nobody's going to be very interested if we simply state it that way. But if we say he's drowning in a sea of grief, that's more interesting. That's a little bit more sort of provocative, and it's going to give readers more to think about. And we can do that. That's really all a metaphor is. It's just a comparison between two things that seem very unlike each other. But we're basically showing that they have something in common. They are kind of similar in a way. Okay, literally grieving and drowning, they're not the same, right? They're not necessarily two things we would compare, but we can find commonality between them. So these are often sort of unusual or unexpected comparisons that make us think a little bit more. There's a famous metaphor. We think Shakespeare said it, but I don't really know. The whole world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. That's just an old-fashioned term for actors. So obviously Shakespeare wrote plays. He was also an actor. So he's talking about his own world here, but this is a metaphor. He's making a comparison between a play, a story told in partly written and partly visual form on a stage. He's comparing that, a play, to real life. He's comparing the world to a stage, and he's comparing all of us, the people who live in the world, to actors. So I am not literally an actor. I would assume most of you are not either, but we understand what he's saying, right? The way that we often understand our lives is often very based on narrative. We are sort of characters. We're the main character in our own life. And the things that happen to us can almost be sort of considered similar or related to what we might see in a play or a novel or a movie or a TV show. So he's just making the argument that everyday lives are kind of perceived as plays. They kind of are, in some ways, similar to plays. Not literally. The world is not literally a stage, and we are not all literally actors. But he's making a comparison that sort of communicates a larger point, and it helps to create more vivid descriptions. So similes are doing something, basically doing the same thing. But with metaphors, we're saying that one thing is the other. The world is a stage, and all men and women merely players. We are actors. The world is a stage. He is drowning in grief. So that's what a metaphor does. A simile does the same kind of comparative work. A simile also compares two unlike things by saying that one is like another. That's the difference. Similes use words like or as, and metaphors don't. So a metaphor is a more direct comparison, saying this thing is the other thing. Whereas a simile says this thing is like another thing. So a simile takes a little bit of the force out. It's a little bit less of a strong comparison, but it's still doing the same basic work. Okay? I move fast like a cheetah. That is not a literal statement. No human can actually run as fast as a cheetah, but I'm simply telling my readers that I am fast, so I am comparing myself to a cheetah. I'm saying that I am like that animal. I am not a cheetah, I'm like a cheetah. So that's it's a difference of degree. Metaphors are a little bit stronger, a little bit more direct. Similes have a little bit of a qualifier. I'm like a cheetah, I'm not exactly a cheetah, but I run fast like one. Just a more imaginative, descriptive way of saying that a character is fast. So we see metaphors and similes all the time. If once you're able to read Salvation by Langston Hughes, one of our first examples of a narrative that we're looking at in our book, you'll see a phrase, I think this is in Hughes, where he refers to a sea of shouting. Okay, that's like metaphorical language. He's not speaking literally. He's describing a crowded church where everybody is sort of speaking and there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of voices, there's a lot of noise. So it creates something that kind of feels like an ocean or a sea of noise. But again, that's not literal, that's figurative. The shouting is being compared to, or the character being sort of lost in the shouting is being compared to that character perhaps being lost at sea. So that's really what figurative language does. It just gives us these sort of imaginative ways of seeing reality and different ways of understanding characters' emotions or what characters are going through. It's a little bit more fun, a little bit more creative, and often a lot more descriptive than just saying things like, he was sad, she's really fast, and that room was really loud. Those are all factual statements. They might be okay, but sometimes there's more interesting, more compelling ways of presenting that same information if we want to use figurative language. So again, similes, we're going to see words like or as. Something is like something else, or something functions as something else. Whereas metaphors, something is something else. But they do the same basic thing, comparing two unlike things to make a larger statement. A few other types of figurative language that we're going to see. Personification. You might know that one. That's when we attribute human qualities to non-human things. And we do this a lot. Opportunity knocked at the door. Opportunity is an abstract concept. That's not something that has the ability to actually knock. Opportunity does not have hands. So that's personification. We're giving an abstract concept human qualities. We also do this with animals. We might do this with like inanimate objects, giving them human qualities. And often we're doing that to either create mood, to create sort of a sense of how things feel. It also might give us access to how characters feel. And it's just often a more interesting way to describe animals, inanimate objects, or abstract concepts, things that can sometimes be hard to get our arms around. Sometimes we can give them human attributes, and that makes it a little bit easier to kind of see what's happening. The sun greeted me this morning. It's another example. The sun cannot literally do that, but that's just another way to say that when I woke up this morning, sun was pouring through my window. All right, and let's see. I think I wanted to mention hyperbole. That's just an intentional exaggeration. We've all heard these before. I've told you a million times to clean up your room. That's not a literal statement. I probably have not said it a million times, but I've said it multiple times. And that's the point I'm trying to make. It feels like I've said it a million times. I keep saying it. So I'm making the point that it's been repeated and you need to just go ahead and do it. So we often use this intentional exaggeration to communicate certain feelings. I've been sitting in traffic all day. That's not a literally true statement, but it helps to communicate how I feel and how bad the traffic is. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Again, not a literal statement, but my parents used to always say that, and it just means I'm very hungry. So again, we can use it to kind of emphasize how we feel. We can use it to just sort of convey, how something feels to a character rather than how something literally is. Again, this is a figurative statement, not a literal one. So that's probably good. And just remember, imagery is another technique, a lot like figurative language, that's just going to drive home our descriptions, make them come alive. And also, a lot of good description will also work a little bit with symbolism. Symbolism means that people or objects or places will represent larger things. So often when we're looking at narrative and we're focusing on description in particular, we're going to notice a lot of symbolism. Oftentimes metaphors or other types of figurative language will help to sort of communicate symbolism. If there's a particular thing that's being described that has importance beyond just its physical, literal existence. Okay, if something has larger significance, it means something more, or it has a certain specific orientation that it usually gives people, that's going to be important to notice as well. So we all know big symbols like the American flag, the skull and crossbones, even something like roses or apple pie. Those are objects that obviously have physical, literal existence, but they also symbolize things. Apple pie represents America or something, right? Love has a lot of larger things, larger ideas attached to it. That's often the case. And so roses might be representing love, right? So a lot of times physical objects can represent abstract concepts. Again, things like love, you can't pick up and hold love. But a rose is something that can be described. It's a real object that might represent love. So that's really what symbolism is. It's when things represent bigger things. Everyday objects or places that have bigger, larger significance. So that also frequently gets communicated to us through description. Okay, so that's it for today. We're going to look at some examples of good descriptive writing this week. Then we're going to practice sort of working with some of those descriptions. And once we turn to our narratives, next week, once we start working on our own narratives, we're obviously going to be using a lot of these descriptive techniques. So I will see you next week as we get started on Essay 1.